Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mental Health Commission's webinar series on integrating psychological health and safety in the workplace. Today's webinar topic is making suicide prevention a workplace priority. My name is Carla Thorpe, and I'm the Director of Prevention and Promotion Initiatives with the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And I have the pleasure of being your host for today's webinar. Just before we get started, I'm going to go through a few short housekeeping items. In order for us to have some dialogue and exchange at the conclusion of our presentation, we'd invite you to send any questions or comments using the chat feature, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. If it doesn't show up for you already, it may be an icon on the upper right-hand corner of your screen that says chat and has a little bubble, so you can click on that and then the chat window should appear for you on the right-hand side of your screen beside the PowerPoint slides. So we'd encourage you when you're sending your questions, if you could please, using the drop-down in terms of who you're sending it to, select all panelists so that the question goes to myself as well as to our presenter today. And then we'll ask questions on your behalf. The webinar today is also being recorded and will be posted on the Mental Health Commission of Canada's website in the webinar archive section following the presentation in about 2 weeks' time. As I mentioned, because of the large number of participants that we're so pleased that are joining us today, we have muted all of your phone lines just to eliminate any background noise. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, Sally Spencer Thomas, who's the CEO and co-founder of the Carson J Spencer Foundation. Dr. Sally Spencer Thomas is a clinical psychologist, a mental health advocate, a faculty member, a consumer of mental health services, and a survivor of her brother's suicide. She is the president of the Suicide Prevention Coalition of Colorado, and also holds leadership positions either on the board of directors or as a task force or committee chair for the International Association of Suicide Prevention, the American Association of Suicidology, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. So we're so pleased that she took the time out of her very busy schedule with all of these affiliations to join us today. In the fall of 2014, Sally was an invited attendee at the White House and the World Health Organization's mental health briefings and has also won multiple awards for her tremendous advocacy in this area. So we're delighted to have you with us, Sally. You truly are a shining light of hope, and we thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to turn things over to you to get us started with the formal presentation.
Thank you so much, Carla and Tina and the Mental Health Commission. It is quite an honor for me to do this with you today, and I'm so pleased to have this opportunity. So how many of you know this woman? And how many of you know her now? And how many of you knew that when she was a jobless single mother, she was scribbling story ideas on cocktail napkins as she seriously considered suicide? This is the reason why we're here. Many people are struggling in despair and isolation, and yet they don't know what's on the other side of that. And if we can help surround people with caring and compassionate friends, family, and coworkers, we're going to be able to save lives. So this is our presentation today and the goals for this webinar. It's going to go very quickly. I usually spend a whole day talking about these topics, so this is a very condensed version. But I'm going to be making a business case for suicide prevention. We're going to be looking at some of the cost issues and why it makes sense to have suicide prevention in a workplace. We'll talk about some key strategies and a comprehensive approach and how to sustain that. And one of the key factors in really engaging workplaces is understanding the stages of change that workplaces are in and how to meet workplaces where they're at to really have effective implementation of a suicide prevention program. We'll talk about a blueprint and what that looks like for different steps and different stages. And then finally, we'll talk about how workplaces can effectively respond in the aftermath of a suicide loss. Now, one of the things that's really important to me whenever I do presentations is that that the conversation and the information doesn't just stay with the immediate audience that's receiving it, but that we collectively can share this with a much larger audience. So if you are one of those folks that engaged with Twitter or Facebook, I really encourage you to engage a wider audience during the presentation today using one of these hashtags. The hashtag for today's event will be #WorkingMinds or Workplace Mental Health, whichever one. And then these other ones are just places to engage audiences that are paying attention to these issues. SPSM stands for Suicide Prevention Social Media, and there's a whole bunch of people out there that are very interested to learn more. So you heard my professional bio. I always know that it's important for folks to also know a little bit about the personal. So I was born and raised in Connecticut, and I moved out to Colorado for graduate school and never left. In fact, dragged my whole family out eventually. I have 3 sons, ages 16, 14, and 10, and I have a very strange habit of running long distances extremely slowly, and I'm trying to do a marathon in all 50 states and maybe someday Canada too. All right, so you heard in my bio that while I do have a degree in psychology and I teach in this area, I also have lived experience. I lost my brother Carson to suicide a little over 10 years ago. Carson was a very influential and dynamic business leader and entrepreneur in Denver who happened to live with bipolar illness. He had been diagnosed at age 19 and for the most part managed it incredibly well throughout his adult life. In the last year of his life, however, he had a full-blown episode of mania and really unraveled all the things that were important to him, his family and his work and his income and his finances, and he never recovered. So in the aftermath of his death, my family and his closest friends from around his lifespan founded the Carson J Spencer Foundation in his memory. And the founders were very clear about 2 things from the beginning. Number 1, we were going to do bold, gap-filling things to prevent what happened to him from happening to other people, and that we were also going to celebrate the life that he lived, and do so by celebrating entrepreneurship and business leadership and really working to engage businesses. So the Carson J Spencer has a vision about engaging leaders and communities. So we're really talking about cultural change and systems change. And rather than just eliminate the symptom of suicidal thoughts and behavior, what we really want to do is help people become back engaged with a passion for living. We do this through very innovative approaches. Again, we're trying to find the biggest gaps out there and find really innovative ways to fill those. So that people can talk about this more matter-of-factly and really think about it as another health and safety priority in their lives, in their workplaces, and in their schools. And our core values, again, center on the things that Carson brought to this world about entrepreneurship and collaboration. And we're also really focused on upstream work. We want people to prevent the crisis of suicide from ever happening in the first place. So what pieces do we need to put in place to prevent these things? Our first program, which I'll mention briefly here and then discuss a little bit more throughout the hour that we have, was Working Minds. We figured if students and youth were being reached through schools, then it made sense to reach working-aged people through the workplace. One of the biggest gaps that we discovered shortly after Carson's death was that the good chunk of people who were dying by suicide were just like Carson, a white working-aged man with a diagnosable mental health condition and a substance abuse issue. And back in 2005, very little was being done to address that population. So we set out to change that through the Working Minds program and really translated some things that were evidence-based to the civilian workforce. We designed the program, we designed a toolkit, we got everything up on the best practice registry, and really it was crickets. People really didn't respond right away. And I'll share a little bit more about the lessons learned on that journey as we go through today. But that was our first program that kind of launched in 2007. So let me now shift to why the workplace. Why does it make sense to do this work in the workplace? This is a quote that was published in the Wall Street Journal a number of years ago. And it says, "The workplace is the last crucible of sustained human contact for many of the, what is now 41,000 people who kill themselves each year in the U.S. A coworker's suicide has a deep, disturbing impact on workmates. For managers, such tragedies pose challenges no one ever covered in management school." And that actually is the case. Although 85% of middle managers believe part of their job and responsibility is to identify and intervene to help employees with depression, only 18% of managers have ever received any training that would prepare them to do so. So there's this gap between what people feel responsible for and what they feel prepared to do. So these next set of slides are generously given to us for this presentation from a very wonderful partner of ours, the Partnership on Workplace Mental Health. We just collaborated on a presentation in Montreal together last week at the International Association of Suicide Prevention. And this is some of the work that they do, is creating business cases around mental health. About up to 25% of the U.S. population experiences mental illness in any given time, and about 1 in 5 is the number of Canadians who will experience mental health problem or illness this year. Nearly 2/3 of people with a diagnosable mental health condition do not seek treatment. So we are witnessing a whole bunch of people falling through the cracks or not getting the qualified care that can help them. Typically, the delay of care often lasts for a decade. So if you think about mental health conditions as progressive illnesses, which they often are, during that time, many things are worsening. There's often collateral problems like job stability and family problems that start to emerge over this time when things aren't getting dealt with. And then the comorbidity with other health conditions can consume 2 to 3, 4 times the healthcare resources of other enrollees. So we're seeing all of these collateral problems with other health issues as well. The good news is that we know that treatment and recovery works and is possible, and from a cost perspective, it's relatively inexpensive compared to the benefits to the person and the people and systems surrounding that person. So investing in mental health and substance use disorders yields a very positive return on investment, especially when you factor not only is this person healthier, but they're also more productive and more efficient. So the bottom line that we're making to workplaces that you just really can't afford, literally can't afford to ignore mental health. It will impact your bottom line. In a deeper dive, let's look at specifically depression. About 1 in 10 adults will experience depression at some point in their lives. And also in my bio, you heard that I also have lived experience as a mental health consumer. And in the spring of 2012, I had kind of a perfect storm of life challenges and physical challenges that all kind of came together in a point in time. And I experienced my first episode of major depression. And as someone who's, clinically trained and I have all this knowledge, it absolutely brought me to my knees. I watched myself fall into the chasm, and in that experience, was really overwhelmed with the symptoms of not sleeping and not being able to eat and really not being able to experience any kind of pleasure, really having a much foreshortened view of the future and no sense of hope. It was really incredibly difficult, and I think, for many of us that are in the role of helping, until we've actually had that experience of feeling so helpless and hopeless, it's the empathy is just, it's more of a challenge sometimes than if you've actually gone through it yourself. So depression is a very much significantly debilitating experience that many people have. And they're much more likely when they are having depression to also have all these kinds of additional health problems, heart disease, stroke, all kinds of other things that compound the already compromised person. 80% of people living with depression report some significant level of functional impairment. So they're not getting along with their family members as well, or they're not getting along with coworkers, or they're not able to focus. And so presenteeism, where people are showing up but not functioning, and absenteeism is very common with people who are living with depression. In a 3-month period, people with depression miss an average of 4.8 work days and suffer about 11.5 days of reduced productivity. So this is a very, very costly thing to go left untreated. what we see in terms of costs to the workplace are really just a fraction of what's actually being incurred. So we see medical costs, we see pharmacy costs and disability costs, but below that, some of the things that are not always being calculated are this issue of presenteeism, that loss of productivity, the overstaffing or people compensating for the person who's not being able to perform, the recruitment and hiring costs and the retraining when people are not able to retain their position. All of these add additional costs when mental health conditions and suicidal thoughts and behavior kind of go unchecked. So suicide impacts the workplace on a number of levels. And one of the things that when I told you that our first effort out of the gate kind of hit the world with a thud was because when I was talking to people, when I was talking to employers, the response I commonly got was, oh no, we've not had a suicide at the workplace as long as I've worked here for decades. No one's ever taken their life at work. Well, okay, it turns out that suicide at a workplace is a pretty rare event. It's not common that people take their own lives at their workplace. But that doesn't mean that suicide and suicidal behavior are not affecting a workplace every single day. So yes, suicides can happen on a work site. We had a cluster of financial industry suicides that happened in January, February, and March of 2014 where people were jumping off buildings. And certainly when it happens at the work site, it affects people in many, many ways. It's very traumatic as well as the grief and loss that's happening. But that's a very rare event. A recent published study by the Department of Labor did show, however, that these rare events are actually increasing in frequency. So while they're rare, people are paying attention to them because they're happening more often than they used to. More likely, people will take their lives off-site, at their homes or at a public place or at a hotel, and those employee suicides also affect the workplace. Sometimes people are not categorized as an employee because they've recently been terminated or laid off, which is, of course, a triggering event for people who are already depressed or feeling hopeless. So those numbers might not be counted in a workplace fatality count, but those deaths also very much affect a workplace. Suicides by loved ones is also something that affects the workplace. Partners, children, parents, siblings. There's often a collective grieving that happens because workmates tend to know each other's personal lives and get connected to those people. And then suicidal behavior also affects workplaces. So attempts, thoughts certainly affect people get very scared and concerned and don't know what to do, and all of this affects the workplace. We also know that work can be a triggering event, as I mentioned. That those without jobs are often 2 to 4 times more likely to take their lives, and sometimes those left behind are on edge. They're doing more with less. They're kind of waiting for the next shoe to fall, and they're kind of nervous, and sometimes they're sabotage, and all of these things are affecting people's mental health. And we're also starting to pay a little bit more attention now to, as I mentioned, these clusters, these groups of suicides that are happening in a certain geography or in a certain period of time. There was a large cluster in France telecom industry where there were 35 suicides in 2 years. We've also seen some in China. So while it's not as common as we see with high school students and youth clusters, there is starting to become an awareness that if there's one, we might be at risk for seeing more than one in a certain period of time. The impact of the recession, it took us some time to get the data sorted out to show the impact that had, but it's clear that the global financial crisis did have an impact on suicide deaths. During the time between 2008 and 2012, there was a big jump in the increase in hotline calls each year, and many of them became more about finance and workplace-related stressors. So there's a number of reasons why we should focus on the workplace. Number one, when it's working well, it can really be a positive influence that keeps people hopeful and focused on meaning in their life. Workplaces touch so many people, and it has to be part of an overall community response to all kinds of health issues, not just suicide or mental health issues, but if we're really going to be successful in integrating healthy behavior, workplaces have to be part of that. When it's working well, it's a place of belonging for employees where they can feel a sense of community and connection and social support. And again, when it's working well, it's a place of effectiveness or purposefulness, meaningfulness in people's lives. Sometimes when people are having out-of-control things happen in their personal lives, whether it's a divorce or difficult child issues or health issues with loved ones, workplace becomes a sanctuary where people can go in for 8 hours or so. They can feel like they can have some sense of control over their lives. The other reason why workplaces matter in this equation is because there's often a sense of infrastructure and readiness that makes this work, it can flow through a workplace. There's usually well built-in dissemination methods of information. There's often in larger employers a built-in referral mechanism for mental health services through the EAP, Employee Assistance Program. Many workplaces now, in their struggle to retain young talent, know that they can't abuse their employees anymore. If they really want young movers and shakers to stick around, they need to take care of their employees in a holistic way. Kind of the mind, body, and spirit all have to be considered if they're going to stick around. So many of them are building in wellness programs and other kinds of full person engagement things so that the person really feels like their whole being is taken care of. And then finally, ever since the 80s, workplaces have been paying attention to violence prevention, violence in the workplace. And many of kind of the systems and strategies of early identification and, direct questioning and linking to further evaluation play a similar role as suicide prevention. The challenge with that is, those trains are can be linked together, but it's probably going to cause a lot of additional challenges because people are already stigmatized to think that mental health is related to violence. So that alliance needs to be very delicately woven. When there is a suicide in the workplace, many people are significantly affected. This is a study by Lanny Berman, who is the former executive director for the American Association of Suicidology, and he found that surviving partners of someone who took their life intimately and directly affected, on average, 20 coworkers. So 20 people are saying, this had a significant impact on my life. And what we know is that for men, losing a coworker by suicide increases their risk considerably. So workplaces that are most at risk, when we look at some of the risk factors for suicide in general, and then you can kind of think about what workplaces also have those qualities, those tend to be the ones that we're focused on. So male-dominated workplaces, since the majority of people who die by suicide are men, and that's true internationally, especially white males, workplaces that tend to be more male-dominated have increased risk of suicide deaths. When the nature of the work gives somebody access to lethal means and familiarity and comfort with lethal means, that is also increased risk. So obviously our law enforcement personnel, but also our physicians who have a comfort with certain types of lethal medications. Workplaces that have what Dr. Thomas Joyner calls an acquired capacity or a fearlessness for death also can have increased risk. So these are workplaces where people are rewarded or are going in with a sense of courage and bravery, or sometimes recklessness, risk-taking, and or stoicism. There's a great sense of we don't show weakness here, we're very strong, we're very powerful, we're very courageous. And again, there's a whole host of reasons why those qualities are really important for certain types of vocations. But when it comes to someone who's also suicidal, it can cause increased risk. Exposure to trauma through the workplace, when not supported properly, or when kind of gone unchecked, or when the trauma itself contributes to a sense of hopelessness or helplessness to the person experiencing it, those things can also increase risk. Often, when we have those types of qualities together, the stoicism, the high stress, the exposure to trauma, it's not uncommon to also see a culture of substance abuse coming into play as people are trying to self-medicate these uncomfortable feelings of anxiety and depression and feeling overwhelmed. Often workplaces can also find a kind of a fragmented sense of community. This often happens with seasonal types of jobs, so construction, or we're seeing it sometimes in resort communities where people are coming in and out. When there's not that sense of belongingness in the workplace family, sometimes that can increase people's senses of isolation. And when the work itself is kind of purposelessness or maybe even doing harm to other people, there can be a sense of shame. Sometimes there are big public things that happen that are humiliating. That can also be a triggering event. And then finally, this idea of entrapment, and this can come in a number of flavors, but very often it's, people just don't feel like they can get out of either a toxic work situation or one that has lost meaning for them. In my brother's case, it was all about kind of upward mobility. He was very successful, and so he kept getting a bigger and bigger income and higher titles, and his standard of living kept reaching up to match that. And at some point, he called it his golden handcuffs, that he had gotten to a place where it was just very challenging to do the work, and the benefits weren't always there, and yet he couldn't feel like he could leave or kind of sacrifice a level of income or a standard of living, and so he was trapped. All right, so now I'm going to turn to the comprehensive approach, and I've alluded to a couple times. I'm just going to touch on it very briefly here. Thomas Joyner's model for suicide risk is something that everybody interested in suicide and suicidal behavior should be familiar with. So I'm going to touch briefly here, but I encourage you to read his work, especially his book, Why People Die by Suicide, published by Harvard University Press. So Thomas looked at all the risk factors for suicide and found that there were over 200 known risk factors, which is way too much information for people to process when they're trying to determine if someone is at risk or not. And he boiled it down to these three common pathways. Obviously, we need a desire for suicide to be at risk, but a desire for suicide is a necessary but not sufficient condition to have increased risk for suicide death. He argues now, with a lot of research behind him, that someone would also need this acquired capacity or this fearlessness for death. So on the desire for suicide, it's made up of two components. One is perceived burdensomeness. So in this model, Thomas turns conventional wisdom on its head, that it's not a sense of being selfish, but it's actually being selfless, that the person believes that they have become such a burden to the people who love and support them that by going away, by dying, people are going to be relieved. They're going to be relieved of that burden. Now, obviously, it's perceived in the majority of cases that nobody's better off when somebody dies by suicide. And the perception often comes from the consequences of the mental health condition as people's tunnel vision and self-loathing kind of play a role. The other part for desire for suicide is what Thomas labeled thwarted belongingness. So being in social relationships, being connected is really essential to people's mental health and well-being. And when those primary relationships, those really inner circle relationships are taken away from us by divorce or separation or death or moving or getting incarcerated or getting kicked out of school or losing a job, the many, many ways that we lose our relationships, that also kind of increases suicidal thoughts. So put that together, burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness, and a desire for suicide is common. You'll become a much higher risk for death when there's that acquired capacity piece, a fearlessness. And that comes in three ways as well. Sometimes people have a temperament for it. They're born into the world as risk takers. Sometimes they learn it through a series of provocative and painful experiences over the course of their life as they start to build this outer shell of a buffer. And sometimes it comes in the way of being familiar and having access to lethal means like firearms. So again, there's a bunch of people over in the acquired capacity bubble that aren't at risk for suicide, but when they get that desire, they're at much higher risk. So now you can just start to think about, too, what kind of workplaces might have those risk factors. The comprehensive approach really looks at the whole spectrum of mental health promotion and suicide prevention. I think when people hear suicide prevention, they immediately go to managing the crisis of suicide, managing a suicide attempt or a suicide death. And we know that that work is incredibly resource intensive, it's draining, and we're going to lose a lot of people if that's our sole focus of prevention. So we need to back up from that crisis, that downstream approach of suicide prevention, and start to look upstream to see what kinds of things can head that off or prevent the despair and distress from happening in the first place. So obviously, if we're treating mental health conditions with effective treatments, we can help people alleviate that despair. If we increased help seeking and linked people to care earlier, and even peer support and many different types of care, as the distress is emerging, perhaps we can even head off some of the more significant mental health challenges from coming. When we know that there are certain risk populations that have many factors that are increasing their rate and risk for suicide and mental health problems, we can put an extra dose of protection around them, an extra dose of resources to make sure that should they have any emerging problems, that they're quickly surrounded. And then I love the top one because we just don't do it enough. How do we actually promote what mental health looks like, not just the absence of symptoms, but how do we teach our young people, like we do physical health, this is what mental health looks like. When you're mentally healthy, this is how you think. This is how you engage with other people. This is how you behave towards the things that are important to you in your life. And give them some benchmarks. We know how many glasses of water to drink and how many steps to take and how many hours of sleep we need to get a night. And then we've got biomarkers of body mass index and blood pressure. And so we have a bunch of things on the physical side that keep us in a framework where we know when we're physically healthy or not. But we don't have those conversations the same with mental health. And these are all things that workplaces can play a part of. So to reiterate, upstream prevention is really about promoting protection, and we can do that by promoting social networks, by teaching people about mental health literacy, and by providing life skills like emotional intelligence and conflict resolution and communication skills. Midstream prevention is really about early identification and effective referral. So these are things like gatekeeper training. How do we train everyday people to notice emerging symptoms and quickly link people to care, kind of like the CPR model? How do we screen for mental health issues, not just blood pressure, but depression and anxiety and substance abuse? How do we promote and normalize help seeking and reduce the barriers that people often have about their thoughts about what help seeking is all about? And then how do we make sure that when we finally send people to various types of mental health services, that they are well trained with evidence-based treatments and suicide risk assessment and management strategies. Downstream is when the crisis is already emerging, how do we make sure to get the lethal means temporarily or even permanently out of the hands of the person who is in that red-hot crisis of suicide? What we know is that if we remove those means during that red-hot crisis and that people get to the other side, they don't tend to switch means. That means matter, that people get really attached to thinking about how they will do it, and if we can create an interruption to their access to those means, we can often save their lives. So how do we restrict the means? How do we treat people in the midst of their suicide crisis with dignity and empowerment and collaboration rather than what we see too often of quote-unquote treatment that is actually more like punishment and is really more about the fear of the provider than what's going to actually be helpful for the person. And then in the aftermath of a suicide death, how do we provide safe and effective grief and trauma support? Because how we respond in the aftermath of suicide death matters greatly to the people left behind and can, if not done well, can increase suicide risk for the survivors of loss. So the U.S. Air Force back in the late 1990s kind of put together those three pieces and created this comprehensive approach that they sustained from 1995 to 1999. And during that time, they saw a significant reduction in suicide death rates, about a 33% reduction during the time that they were implementing their program. Then they stopped doing their program, the rates went up again, and they started it again, and the rates went down again. So probably never again in our history will we have a large enough community sample like the U.S. Air Force that has good surveillance strategies, and we have this A-B design where we have no intervention, intervention, no intervention, intervention, and the numbers go in the direction that we want. So this has become, that comprehensive approach that I just showed you has become kind of the gold standard for all kinds of systems, schools and universities, tribal communities, states, and workplaces. The other piece of good news from this study was it wasn't only the suicide death rates that went down, but they also saw collateral decreases, which means that they weren't targeting these behaviors, but they went down anyway. In homicide, a significant reduction in homicide, a significant reduction in accidental death, severe family violence, and moderate family violence. The mild family violence is actually was about verbal conflict, so they saw that go up because people were actually talking through their conflict instead of engaging in physical violence, which is actually a good thing. So again, going back to the early story of the Working Minds program and how when we released it in 2007 and 2009, we didn't really get a very strong response, even though we knew the strategies that we were promoting in the workplace would have a positive effect, and we knew from the numbers that there were many, many people in workplaces that were having suicidal thoughts or being affected by their own suicidal behavior or someone else's behavior. And what it really boiled down to was that workplaces, just like humans, go through various stages of change. You can think about in your own life if you've ever made a big change like quitting smoking or going on a diet or anything like that. You probably have gone through a period where you didn't really consider your behavior a problem. Maybe your friends were doing it worse than you, and it just wasn't in your radar to think of it as anything that you needed to change. And so we call that pre-contemplation. And then at some point, maybe there was pros and cons entering in your brain about maybe I have a problem, maybe I don't, maybe I should change, maybe I shouldn't. When you determine that, yes, it's probably better that I change, then there's an action plan that usually gets created. You engage in the action, and then you maintain that change. So workplaces and other systems go through the same stage of change, and when we're trying to motivate people to move through the stages of change, we have targeted types of interventions. So when people are in pre-contemplation, we just try to bring a gentle, personalized awareness and reflection about when things are troublesome or causing problems in their life. When they're in contemplation, we encourage them to think more about the pros and cons. It's not until determination that we actually make a plan for action, and then not until action that we actually do something. So the problem was we were championing change, do something, when workplaces were in pre-contemplation. We don't have a problem here. And that mismatch caused a lot of yes buts, or not for me, it's not my issue, it's not my problem. So the very first thing to engage workplaces in this work is to really spend time listening. And there's a number of strategies. Again, this is a much longer part of the workshop I'm going to touch upon here, but it's a really critical piece. We need to understand what their work culture is about, what their priorities are, what their strengths are, protection factors, where their vulnerabilities are. And one of the ways to do that is to bring leaders together to have a dialogue about this. Usually we need some kind of internal champion within the industry. Often they have lived experience either being bereaved or having someone close to them struggle. They bring in their peers, we help facilitate a conversation, and that's often how it can start to be identified as a priority within an industry. Then we can move more to a grassroots focus of getting buy-in and listening by doing focus groups and surveys and in-depth interviews with stakeholders. We can look at utilization rates and EAP and referrals. We can just do an environmental scan of the workplace and see what the actual physical space of the workplace is saying to us about the value of mental health. So all of these pieces are really critical, and you have to be patient to go through this process, because if you jump over it, things usually blow up in your face. I've worked with workplaces where it's taken a year and a half just to do this step, but it's a very good investment because with it comes a lot of credibility that you're building and trust. And then we need to have the leaders step into this place of being active. They need to be visible and visionary and vocal and kind of stepping forward and saying, this is important, this matters. This quote is actually from the Higher Education Center and was used in relationship to substance abuse in colleges and universities, but the same idea applies. It's easy for leaders to hide behind, it's not my business, it's not my thing to do. But those really proactive and bold leaders will step forward and say, you know what, I need to be the first one here. I need to make sure that we're proactive and not just reacting to suicide crises, but trying to prevent it from happening in the first place. And sometimes it just takes one of the industry leaders to do that, and many others follow through. So the leadership common threads of success is that people be bold, that they become fearless in their ability to stand up and stand for this issue, and that they become very visible within their peer group around this. One of the ways that they've had success in positioning their messaging is really about making suicide prevention a health and safety priority. A lot of the industries that are male-dominated actually have a good culture of safety, so construction and first responders, and so this kind of dovetails nicely with their overall importance of having a safe workplace. Leaders with lived experience are worth their weight in gold. Bereaved leaders can share that impact story, but leaders who actually share their story of their own mental health crisis, of their own suicide crisis, do more to eliminate stigma than just about anything that I know. We just had a U.S.-Canada forum on workplace suicide prevention here in Denver back in September. It was a 5-hour meeting. We had 70 C-level people involved. We had one 5-minute break, kind of the recipe for a disaster for a bunch of AD executives, but they were riveted. They didn't leave. They were incredibly engaged, and the reason for it is because we had 3 executives stand up and say, me too. I've experienced this in my life. And again, by the numbers we know, and by the isolation of many leaders, we know that these things happen. Obviously, leaders have hierarchical influence with the people that report to them, but they also have incredible peer influence and can move things along quickly when they're doing the right things. The other common thread is that
it's Carla here. I think we're 2 slides behind on the PowerPoint deck. So if you could maybe, and I think you've covered the next one as well.
Oh, that's weird because I see something different. So, I'm not quite sure what to do if I'm seeing something different. Do you want to advance them?
Sure. Maybe we'll do that instead, and I think we're on the next one already.
Okay. I'm on Other Voices of Lived Experience?
Correct, yeah. So okay. we're at the same spot as you now. We've got maybe about another 10 minutes, and then we're going to open up for some questions, too.
Yep, I'm good. So lived experience is definitely a common thread of success, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the leadership. Vicariously credible peers talking about their recovery really opens up the conversation and permission. People do need coaching on how to tell their stories effectively. I like the ratio of about 20% on the downward spiral and the despair, so people can see and feel what that is like. But 80% of the story really needs to be on that turnaround and what's been working in their recovery. People also need to be coached in safe messaging and effective impact stories and how to share about resources. All right, so the last piece before we open up for questions is really about postvention. This is a term that's emerged in suicidology about how we respond to the aftermath of suicide. And the Suicide Prevention Resource Postvention Group defines it as the provision of crisis intervention and other support after a suicide has occurred to address and alleviate the possible effects of suicide. So there's immediate response, there's short-term response, and there's long-term response, and the most effective postvention is proactive, that people are actively reaching out to the people most affected rather than waiting for them to stumble upon. Back in 2013, we had a collaborative effort among the Carson J Spencer Foundation, the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, Crisis Care Network, and the American Association of Suicidology to put together this manager's guide to suicide postvention in the workplace. What we discovered is that people were not necessarily being proactive, but they were hungry for information when they were dealing with the crisis of suicide, and they needed a resource to get to just in time. So now this resource is a downloadable PDF. I believe it was part of the registration page. So please take it and put it in places where people need to access crisis information just in time. It is designed to be a crisis resource, so it is checklists. It gives people who are in the throes of managing this crisis very concrete action steps in the short, medium, and long term. There are flow charts for decision making. One of the most popular pieces of the guide is that there are communication templates. Sometimes people don't know what to say or how to inform their workforce that there's been a suicide death. So some communication templates usually help quite a bit with that process. And the goal of this guide is to really decrease the impact that suicide can have on a workplace, whether that's complicated and prolonged grief process or trauma responses, or fear of contagion, and really help the workplace come back to some kind of level of functioning. There's often an acute phase where really it's practical assistance that's needed most often. If a suicide's happened on site, how do we clean the space? How do we deal with the space? How do we coordinate this crisis? If there's media involvement, how does a spokesperson get trained to talk about this? And how do we just kind of get through that immediate aftermath in the safest and most effective way? It's not until the short-term piece where we're actually starting to provide people with mental health resources. I think one of the things that our cultures do is that we kind of rush in the immediate aftermath with everybody's got this, that, and the other mental health resource, and usually in the immediate moments after a crisis like that, people can't even put words to their experience, and what they really need more is somebody to give them a lift home or someone to help them sort through this person's belongings. It's much more practical. But in the short term, the group that's most significantly affected will start to rise to the top. And at that point, we need to be sure that we are ready with quality resources like a well-trained employee assistance program or suicide bereavement-specific resources in the community like peer support groups. We need to offer opportunities for ritual and remembrance for the person who's been lost. Sometimes the funeral or memorial service is in another state, and people need sometimes that closure of honoring the person that's been lost. I often tell workplaces, what do you do when there has been a death of an employee? How do you respond? And whatever that culture is, whatever that protocol is, start there, because most people are needing most a chance for mourning more than anything else, and providing that structure so that people can mourn and honor is really important. Not doing that can cause quite a bit of problems, and there's ways to do it that are safe and meaningful. Then how do we, for those most impacted, how do we create some kind of compassionate return to work plan that maybe has some accommodations in their workload or a number of hours? During this short-term period of recovery, leadership's communication is critical. My colleague Bob Vanderpool came up with this acronym called ACT, where when leaders kind of are able to acknowledge the fact that this major event has impacted them personally, when they are able to respond with compassion to their workforce about some of you might be having difficulty experiencing this, and then when they're able to transition the workforce into resilience, prevention, and support, repeating these kinds of messages over and over again does quite a bit to reassure a shaken workforce and help them get back to some new sense of normal and productivity. In the longer term, now we're talking about more kind of a restructuring phase. Again, the pool of people affected is going to shrink over time, but there may be a core group. Maybe it was a really tight-knit workforce. Maybe there was a project that was really important that they were working towards, and now that person's not going to be there. So for that really inner circle group, it's important to keep those channels of communication open, check in to see how they're doing, and if there's a need to honor that life and that contribution around major anniversary or milestone dates, to create safe spaces to do that.
Sally, do we still have you on the line? I think your audio may have cut out. Okay, well, we were just about to come to the question and answer session. Sally, I don't know if you're able to dial back by phone into the webinar to take a few questions. But maybe we'll take advantage of this opportunity to ask the people that are on the webinar today, if you do have any questions for Sally today, I'd invite you again to, on the chat panel, to where it says send to, drop down to all panelists and type in your questions there, and hopefully Sally will be able to rejoin us by phone in a moment to take a few questions before we wrap up. So we'll just give you a moment to reflect on Sally's presentation and type in your questions into the chat panel. And I see we've got one question that has come in already about the acronym that was just, I'm just going to go back a couple of slides and put it back on the screen here. So the question was on number 8 for the lead category with the acronym ACT. The question was, what does the C stand for? So you can see there that it was acknowledge, compassion, and then transition to resilience and prevention. So hopefully that answers the one question.
Can you hear me?
Yes?
This is Sally. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, Sally, you're back on. Wonderful. So we just had one question that we were able to address while we lost you momentarily, so I'm just going to transition back to the bridge slide, and then we'll have you maybe speak to that before we take some more questions.
Oh, the bridge slide. Okay, I've lost my visual as well. That was very strange. I got disconnected in all ways there. But just in closing, this is the Golden Gate Bridge. It's over 60 years old and considered to be an architectural marvel. There have been over 1,000 documented suicides, which means there's been, to be documented, quote unquote documented, there has to be 2 witnesses. There are staff and patrol officers up on the bridge that are trained to stop people who look agitated or despondent, and they do so about 2 to 3 times a week. Each culture has this icon for suicide. In Japan, it's a volcano. In the United States, this is one of ours. And there's been controversy of whether to put up a net or no. Maybe it'll put an idea in someone's head, people think, but we know very clearly that bridge barriers save lives. They've studied the about 515 people who were restrained, and they followed them over the next 2 years and found that 95% of them had not gone on to take their lives. So barriers work, means restriction work. We know of at least 16 people that have jumped and did not die, and 8 of those have been interviewed extensively. This is a 240-foot jump, so there's several seconds to think about the decision. And one of the questions that's asked of the people that jumped, because this is a very different type of, usually with a very lethal means, there's no opportunity for reflection or rescue or anything. So the common question is, what went through your mind as soon as you cleared the bridge? And what people said in their own way was, I had instant clarity that I wanted to live, that I had just made a major mistake. Many people tried to fight for their lives on their way down. Many of them thought, oh my gosh, these problems that I thought were insurmountable are not, and they had clarity as they were going down. No one who has survived that we know of has tried again. So this bridge story is really a story of hope, because even at the last moment of one of the most lethal ways, we can still bring people to life. We can still turn them around when we surround them with care and belongingness and purpose and support. So now I'll take some questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sally. I'm glad you were able to rejoin us. So we will take some questions, so I'll encourage our participants again to use the chat feature to type in your questions for Sally. I know we had a flood of questions that came in from people as they were registering. I think in scanning through the list of questions we got in advance, Sally, you've already covered off a number of them. But one of the common questions that we had come in various forms that I was hoping maybe you could speak to a little more explicitly is, what are some of the signs that someone might be contemplating suicide? So what should people be looking out for in the workplace in terms of their colleagues, friends, even family and other loved ones?
So the first thing to say about that is, none of us want to believe that the people that we love and care about could possibly be struggling with something like this. So there's already kind of a mechanism built into our awareness that maybe says, oh, I'm not really seeing stuff or hearing things. So that's why it also feels so out of the blue sometimes when it happens. But the truth of the matter is that people who are suicidal often have veiled communication or different changes in behavior that indicate that they have some struggle or that something significant is going on. And sometimes to them, it feels like they are shouting from the mountaintops, I'm in trouble, I need help. But because, it's really hard sometimes for us to appreciate that level of despair, we don't always hear or pick up on it. So that's one of the main challenges, is that in our own minds, we have to be open to the fact that this could and often does happen to people that we love. We know that half of college students already at their young age of 21, 22, half of them have already experienced suicidal thoughts. So it is very common that people go into suicidal despair when their life or mental health challenges are so difficult. So we have to be very attuned, and when we see these kinds of changes that I'll mention in a second, we have to be ready to start asking the direct questions, are you thinking of suicide, which is very hard to do and often requires some training and practice to get there. So some of the things that you'll see, and I call it like it's casting out a line to see how you're going to respond. They're often veiled threats or coded communication. And the recipient kind of just, it's that experience where that hair on the back of your neck goes up. You're like, did they just say what I think they just said? Things like, you know, maybe it'd be better if I weren't here, or life is just too hard, or I just can't go on anymore. They're not directly telling you sometimes that they're thinking about suicide. It's much more indirect, but there's this sense of hopelessness and despair that is evoking a follow-up question. So that's a big one. These veiled threats or coded communications about despair, hopelessness, and isolation. You'll also see changes in mood and changes in behavior. So if someone kind of was easygoing and friendly and all of a sudden they're isolating and withdrawing, or they're becoming incredibly irritable and agitated, to check in with them about what's going on for them and starting to have those direct conversations is a way to check that out. Substance abuse is also a huge warning sign. When people's rates of drinking or drug use start to change, as very often it does when people are trying to self-medicate these very uncomfortable feelings, that's another pattern of behavior to look into. Unfortunately, in the workplace, when you have increased substance use, increased irritation and agitation and irritability and anger, often people are getting into trouble before it's acknowledged that they might have something else going on. So really picking up on these things before they become a performance issue, before they become a workplace morale issue is important. So those are just some of the highlights. There are many websites that cover risk factors and warning signs, but those are some of the more common ones.
That's perfect. Thanks, Sally. And we have another question as well on how do you sort of upskill managers to give them the proper training, support, and also the confidence that they would need, if necessary, to have a conversation with someone who reports to them or even a colleague?
That's a great question and one I'm really passionate about. So this idea of training and educating needs to be baked into many different levels of the workplace culture. So it needs to be brought into new employee orientation. It needs to be kind of woven through any kind of wellness programming, any kind of health benefits conversations. And for people going into manager positions or already existing in supervisory roles, there needs to be some kind of consistent reminder and ongoing skill development that dovetails in some of the other places. So it needs to be framed that this is one of the many ways that you're going to build a healthy and safe workforce. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we have worries about your current workforce, but when things emerge, we want you to be prepared. As we know, people rise into manager positions often because they were very good at the trade or the work that they were doing, and they don't necessarily always have great people skills. So a lot of the training that managers and supervisors get is to how to resolve conflicts and how to motivate people and how to maintain performance and so forth. So working these other types of communication skills into those trainings can be part of new manager training. You know, we're going to train you how to motivate your workforce and how to resolve conflicts between employees, and we're going to teach you on how to communicate with an employee that might be having emotional challenges, mental health problems, or other personal issues, and have those things very compassionately. So baking those in throughout the manager's training life makes sense, and also kind of rises it to the same level of, you know, other types of interpersonal skills that they're being trained on. So it normalizes it, basically. The other thing to do, yeah, but I can stop there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if we can maybe squeeze in one last question, and you talked about the importance of having executives kind of speak out and talk about their own personal experience. But we had a question coming in saying, how do you encourage senior executives or senior staff to come forward if they might still be concerned about repercussions in terms of their own careers and future employment opportunities?
No, that's one of those pieces about being bold. It definitely takes a certain type of leader to step forward and say, you know, if this happened to me. But I think the transparency and the trust that they build from being vulnerable speaks far more in terms of the volumes of their character and their leadership than always hiding behind the stoicism wall. You know, I know from our work with, you know, fire departments and so forth, I mean, these are some of the toughest, most stoic people. And yet every single one of them in their own way came forward and said, you know, I had this point in my life where I was overwhelmed. I sought some kind of assistance. And not only am I more healthy because of it, but I'm a better leader because of it. I have more self-awareness and I have more empathy for the people around me. And so I'm grateful that I went through that challenge because now I'm better for it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sally. And we've just put up some resources for other people, and I know we have a few last questions that have come in. We'll try to respond to those of you that we can offline. We do have your contact information, so those that have requested some specific resources, we'll try to get those to you directly by email after the webinar. So I did want to thank you so much, Sally, and to everyone who joined us. We had a big group with us today, so thank you so much for attending this webinar. And Sally, thank you for providing us such great content that I know is really going to make a difference in a lot of Canadian workplaces. So thank you. And we will be taking a break over the summer in July and August with our workplace webinar series, but our series will resume again on September 30th. So again, for those of you that haven't registered for our newsletter alerts for upcoming webinars, we'd encourage you to go to the website and do that. So again, on behalf of the Mental Health Commission, thank you so much, Sally, for being here today, and thanks everyone for joining us, and hope you all have a great day.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.